The America's Democrats podcast, a project of 21st Century Democrats, is made possible by contributions from our listeners. Want to do more? Go to americasdemocrats.org and click Donate. And thank you for allowing us to be your voice. And if you enjoy the show, please share it with your friends on Facebook and Twitter, and leave us a review on your favorite podcast app. This is the America's Democrats podcast, the weekly podcast for stand-up Democrats. I'm your host, Jim Cuddy. This week, Richard Eskow on what he sees missing in the progressive response to the coronavirus pandemic and how to change that. Jeff Schuhrke on what the Biden administration needs to do to deliver for the working class. Plus, Bill Press with Charlie Sykes on Donald Trump's grip on the GOP. Had enough of Fox News, the House Freedom Caucus, and Donald Trump? If you want the facts that you won't get from them or from the fake news sites of the alt-right, then stay tuned. Our sponsor, 21st Century Democrats, works hard to get everyday Democrats involved in returning our party to its roots and to success at the ballot box. Sit back and listen, then stand up and fight. And follow 21st Century Democrats on Facebook for all the latest progressive news. We're glad you can join us. The coronavirus pandemic is revealing long-term systemic failures in American politics and culture. Richard Eskow calls on progressives to recognize the enormity of the challenge and respond with uncompromising vision. And we say hello to Richard R.J. Eskow, a senior advisor for health and economic justice at Social Security Works and the host of The Zero Hour with R.J. Eskow on Free Speech TV. R.J. Eskow, thanks for joining us today on the America's Democrats podcast.
It's a pleasure. Thanks, Jim.
And our pleasure to have you with us. In a recent piece posted on the website Common Dreams, you call for a stronger progressive response to the COVID-19 pandemic. In broad strokes, what are the values and visions progressives need to bring to this fight?
Well, I think one of our big problems in the progressive movement is we get caught up in minutiae, and any of these things are important, but we get caught up in process, we get caught up in theory. And right now we're living in a moment where, we're having the equivalent of a 9/11 every single day in terms of, and then some now, in terms of deaths from the pandemic. And, a lot of people are saying the right things, proposing good things, but what I see missing is the lack of almost war footing, for lack of a better analogy, intensity, sense of emergency, sense of the enormity of the challenge and the enormity of the stakes. It's kind of, for example, to take a moment from today's headlines, we're debating whether to send $1,400 checks versus $2,000 checks and $50,000 income versus 78. We should be running around as if our hair was on fire because so many people are dying. So that's the kind of basic feeling I have about it and that I tried to express in that essay.
I can't help but think historically about FDR, the New Deal, the everybody get on board. We've got to win this fight. Whatever that fight is, it happens to be COVID-19 at the moment, and we're a long way away from that.
We are. And of course, what FDR confronted is a great analogy. Thanks for that. What FDR confronted was an immediate emergency that also reflected long-term systemic failures that needed to be addressed. And I think that the COVID-19 crisis is like that too. It is an immediate emergency. We have lives that need to be saved, but it's heightening fault lines or fractures that have been present in our society, in our economy, in our politics for a long time, in our culture. And I think that, there's an opportunity out of the tragedy to understand what we need to focus on going forward. But I feel that, again, I feel there's some of it, but I don't feel the intensity that I feel especially the progressive movement should be leading the country on. I don't see it resonating in terms of what do we need to do to save lives and end the suffering.
Yeah. Well, and you outlined several ways progressives could act on their vision. You cite the Emergency Health Care Guarantee Act introduced by Senator Bernie Sanders and Representative Pramila Jayapal. What would this accomplish?
Well, specifically, that bill would make sure that people are not financially stressed, that they have access to healthcare at no cost for the duration of this particular emergency. So that bill would give coverage to people who don't have it right now, and it would also offer financial support to those who do have it, because we have essentially an entire country of underinsured people, even if they have quote unquote good insurance. I could go into the actuarial logic behind that, the economic logic, but the bottom line is, for most people in this country, it's a financial strain to go to the doctor or hospital, no matter what kind of coverage you have. So that bill would, for the duration of the emergency, say, we'll pick up the difference until this thing is over. And that would get people into hospitals and into doctors who right now might be reluctant to do so. That reluctance doesn't only endanger them. At a time of a pandemic, it endangers all of us.
And of course, in just general terms, economically, if somebody's healthy, they can work. And if somebody can work, that means they're making money. If they're making money, they're spending money, and the ball continues to roll.
Right. No, you're absolutely right to bring up productivity and economic growth as part of it. And not to mention that if we did something like this, we wouldn't have to be reluctant about having them work, because people can be vectors for the transmission of this and other diseases, because they have to go to work sick, which gets us to, one of the other things we should be looking at, which is making sure everyone has adequate sick leave, so that they don't have to, as well as medical leave, so that they don't have to show up for work sick because they can't afford medical care, and they don't have to show up for work sick because they can't afford to lose the income, both of which are things we're subjecting to people right now. It's undoubtedly making the whole situation worse.
Yeah, absolutely. Now, you also write, RJ, about the need to use more federal resources to manufacture vaccines and to deliver medical care. What more can progressives do to actually make it happen?
Well, I think, look, it's a good sign that the Biden administration has talked about, the Defense Production Act and some of the other tools that are available. But I think basically we've got to say to the country and to the world that whatever they may represent in normal times, we don't in this moment have the luxury of intellectual property rights and the opportunities for big pharma to benefit, and others to benefit enormously through copyright law, through patent law and so on. At this moment, we just need to get it out to everybody as quickly as possible. There are already legal mechanisms to do that. We have the Bayh-Dole Act of 1980. It was Bob Dole and Birch Bayh who supported that and wrote that. We can already override those patents, many of which were developed at public expense anyway, make sure that everybody gets the vaccinations they need, the medical care they need, and use our own production capabilities and laws like the Defense Production Act to make sure they're manufactured in volume enough that everyone can get it. That's something we can do right now, and it's, from an objective point of view, absolutely shocking and baffling that we're not demanding that as a society, because people are dying every day.
Yeah. We're speaking to RJ Eskow, Senior Advisor for Health and Economic Justice at Social Security Works, and the host of The Zero Hour with RJ Eskow. That's on Free Speech TV. Another issue you address, RJ, is childhood education, and citing a Journal of the American Medical Association study that concluded that U.S. school children may experience a lifetime loss of educational achievement. Wow. So how can progressives establish aggressive leadership on this vital issue?
Well, there are a couple ways, and we're seeing particularly lower income children who don't have the kind of internet access that better off children do, may not have the kind of family resources that better off kids do. But all our kids are hurting as a result of this pandemic, so we should be investing massively in forms of education supplement and assistance for all our children. And we should also be looking into the effect that health problems have on the development of young children as well, which predates this pandemic, but is being made worse by it, that when kids live in polluted environments, when there's, when there are other, when they're more exposed to diseases, for example, Black children are 7 to 10 times more likely to die of asthma. This was before the pandemic than white children. These are the kinds of things we should be addressing, both in the context of the pandemic and then going forward as a society.
There are other actions that you suggest in the piece, and I want to suggest to listeners to read it. It's commondreams.org. Again, commondreams.org. But before we end this conversation, you do make a provocative statement at the end of this piece, which is that the old ways of centrism will fail us in our hour of need. Can you expand on that idea?
I only made one provocative statement. I must be losing my touch.
I'll just say it stood out.
Okay. Yes. There are some, the culture of centrism, and I plan to write more about it, but it comes from a different time in our history. In the 1950s, maybe it made sense to negotiate between Democrats of the FDR variety and Republicans of the Eisenhower variety who believed in infrastructure and expanding Social Security and that kind of thing, which was in the 1956 Republican platform. But you can't negotiate and you can't triangulate with life and death. And so the whole philosophy that developed among Democrats in the 90s is, well, let's split the difference. Let's work it out. Let's make sure the business community is happy and the conservatives are happy and all that. We don't have time for that now. If we take that approach to this crisis, then the death will be something that American families and the generations to come will never forgive us for. We'll never be able to forgive ourselves for. So I guess my main message is this: you can't compromise with life and death. You have to save all the lives you can.
I think you can make an argument that the Obama administration suffered the same thing. They tried to deal with Republicans, and Republicans still rejected everything that they wanted to move forward on. And then we end up with a watered down ACA, watered down a lot of other stuff too, because of that. And they had the opportunity to move it forward and they didn't do it. Do you think Joe Biden and his team have learned that lesson since he was there?
I think to a certain extent they have, and I think I think they've showed signs that they have learned that lesson. I think there's a little bit of that going on. I think there's a little bit of the more conservative Democrats also causing them to pull in their horns a little bit. But at the risk of, while I appreciate that they've learned that lesson, learning it is not enough. Your initial proposals have to be bold and recognize the urgency of the moment. And then I think one of the missed opportunities of the Obama administration, rather than negotiating against yourself, if you offer things that will save lives and you present them that way, and your opponents make it impossible for you to carry that out, you can explain that to the voters in the next election and the election after that. Then you have a case to make, as opposed to what the worst outcome would be, which is a record of failing to save lives when it was needed. The electorate will not look kindly on that in 2022 or 2024.
As you look at the current Congress, what hope do you hold that progressives will be able to advance a vision that aligns with their values?
It's a tough one. And, the legislative process is never clean. It's never, it's a constant process of negotiating the left with the moderate left, with the centrists, even I'm just talking about within the Democratic Party itself. So it's a challenge. And I think the best way we can help people do the right thing on the congressional level is through solid activism and through, the things that people sometimes undervalue but make a difference: the phone calls, the letters, the constant contact, the demonstrations, the marches. Well, although that's tougher right now with the pandemic, but any way you can create mass support for bold action, that makes it easier for the people who want to do it to get it done, and it persuades some of the reluctant ones that they need to get it done. Joe Manchin's a perfect example. Voters in his state support a $2,000 checks by a margin of 56%. So we've got to keep getting that message out to people like Joe Manchin, who may be reluctant to do what needs to be done. If we do that, I think we're more likely to have a successful outcome.
Okay. R.J. Eskow, Senior Advisor for Health and Economic Justice at Social Security Works, also the host of The Zero Hour with R.J. Eskow on Free Speech TV. And again, if you want to check out some of the pieces that R.J. has written, commondreams.org, to read them all. There are many provocative statements in all of those writings. So, R.J., thank you so much for your time with us today on the America's Democrats podcast. We'd love to have you back again soon.
Anytime. It was a pleasure.
Thank you. And this is the America's Democrats podcast, the weekly podcast for stand-up Democrats. We want you to sit back and listen to this americasdemocrats.org podcast, a project of 21st Century Democrats. But we need you to stand up and fight. Do you want to get involved and help get our party back to its roots and to success at the ballot box? You can make your contribution to help us keep this show going and to elect Democrats who will stand up for democratic principles. Go to americasdemocrats.org and click on Donate at the top of the page.
This Social Security measure, I believe that we must pass legislation to provide medical care.
This is our tradition. When our grandparents came to America, it was the Democratic Party which said, welcome. It was the Democratic Party, the party of Roosevelt and Truman and Kennedy and others, who said that America belonged to all its people, not just a handful of the rich or a few giant corporations. That's why great leaders like FDR fought so hard for Social Security, and why JFK stood up to the insurance companies and their Republican allies to get Medicare. It's not just one thing, or one time, in one place. It's about a whole history of standing up to the Republicans and saying someone has to be on the side of regular working people in America, whether it's defending Social Security or just the way your loved ones are treated on the job. That's what the Democratic Party is all about. And that's why this message has been brought to you by the Democratic Party. Working people like you and me.
Paid for by 21st Century Democrats. Not authorized by any candidate or candidates committee. This is the America's Democrats podcast, the weekly podcast for stand-up Democrats. Coming up next, with Democrats back in the White House, will they do better this time to support organized labor? But first, we turn to Jim Hightower, America's #1 populist, for his common sense commentary.
I don't know if Nero really fiddled while Rome burned, but we know that Texas Senator Ted Cruz fiddled around while his state froze. While Ted fled Texas for the warmth of the Ritz-Carlton Resort in Cancun, Mexico, dozens of his constituents died in the 5-day deep freeze, and millions more suffered physically and financially. This disaster was not the result of a polar vortex, but of a small-minded vortex of right-wing political hokum that puts the interests of a few energy profiteers over the well-being of the people. Among Texans now paying the price of this political fealty to the corporate interests is a hard-hit group that gets little media notice: small local farmers. I've had the privilege of working with these hardy, innovative people since my days as Texas Agriculture Commissioner. They are America's most productive, most ecologically conscious, most community-spirited ag producers. Yet, state and national farm policies serve the industrial farm giants. For example, tens of billions of our tax dollars are paid out each year in crop insurance, but the program is not geared to the realities and needs of small, local, diversified farms, few of which get any assistance. Indeed, the bulk of payments go to those least in need, the big acreage, multi-million-dollar agribusiness operators, including Wall Street syndicates. So, such efficient enterprising farms in my area as Boggy Creek, Eden East, and Hatton Hart lost row after row of veggies to the killer storm. That means they lost the money invested to produce those crops, lost the money they would have gotten by selling them, and will have to find money from somewhere to put in a new crop. None of them will get a dime from the federal program. This is Jim Hightower saying, not only must we replace our corporate-controlled electric grid, but also our corporate-controlled ag policy and our corporate-controlled public officials.
If you'd like more of Jim Hightower's real populism, check out the Hightower Lowdown. Jim's monthly newsletter gives you the real lowdown on which corporations, by name, are doing what to the middle class, our environment, and our democracy. Each month, the Hightower Lowdown brings you facts you didn't know, along with actions you can take to fight back. It also comes with a sense of humor. Hightower believes we can fight the gods and still have fun. Plus, get this, it's cheap. Only $15 brings you 12 issues a year. For real populism, go to hightowerlowdown.org.
This is the America's Democrats podcast, the weekly podcast for stand-up Democrats. On the campaign trail, Joe Biden promised to be the, quote, best friend labor has ever had in the White House, close quote. Now that he's there, Jeff Schuhrke says labor leaders aren't taking anything for granted in their fight to hold the new administration accountable to the needs of working Americans. And we say hello to Jeff Schuhrke, a labor historian who teaches at the University of Illinois at Chicago. Jeff, thank you so much for joining us today on the America's Democrats podcast.
Thanks for having me. It's my pleasure.
Well, and our pleasure to have you with us. You recently reported for In These Times on what labor unions want to see happen during a Biden administration to advance the interests of the working class. To what extent does this involve reversing Trump-era policies?
Well, to a large extent, especially, right off the bat in the first few days and weeks here of the Biden administration, under Trump, there were a number of executive actions taken aimed at really hurting the rights and benefits of working people. For example, lowering the amount of workers eligible for overtime pay, lower than what the Obama administration had tried to do. And restricting the collective bargaining rights of federal employees. And kind of the biggest thing, though, is the personnel in administrative agencies like the National Labor Relations Board in particular. Trump put in a lot of union busters and, just ideologically anti-union people to run these agencies that are all about trying to set policy and regulate labor relations. So removing those people has been a major demand from unions, and a major expectation, I guess, from unions to the Biden administration. And actually, President Biden has already moved very swiftly on this front. The National Labor Relations Board, Trump had appointed a really notorious union buster named Peter Robb to the position of general counsel, which is a really influential role in setting labor policy. And Biden fired him on his first day in office, January 20th. And then as well, another agency, somewhat more obscure, the Federal Service Impasses Panel, which helps to mediate disputes between the federal government and federal employees. Trump had stacked that with 10 anti-union ideologues, and just recently President Biden asked for all of their resignations. Most of them resigned, a couple he fired. So just the change in personnel and putting people who are just not union busters in charge of these agencies has been really a first step. And so far, President Biden has really delivered on that.
Your reporting finds that, of course, labor's goals don't stop at undoing Trump's anti-worker policies, some of which you just underscored there. You write that labor leaders also hope that Biden will appoint union-friendly members to the National Labor Relations Board, as you mentioned. How would that be different from the composition of the NLRB right now?
So in general, there are 5 seats on the National Labor Relations Board, the NLRB. But right now there's only 4 because there's one vacancy because Trump just simply didn't appoint a fifth member. So of the 4 that are currently on the board, 3 are Republicans and only 1 is a Democrat. But President Biden could quickly change that fairly quickly. With the one vacancy, he could appoint somebody right away. And then in August, one of the Republican members, his term expires. So at that point in August, President Biden could appoint another Democrat. So assuming that process of nominating members and having them confirmed by the Senate goes smoothly and happens without much delay, by the end of the summer or beginning of the fall, there could be a Democratic majority on the National Labor Relations Board. And that means that when it comes to questions of disputes between unions and employers, or questions of labor regulations and policies, there would be a, conceivably much more union-friendly voice on the board, as opposed to people who are just ideologically opposed to the existence of unions.
The decimation that this man created in 4 years is really just astounding to me, and to have that much work to do for a new administration coming in to rebuild, and not just the NLRB, but all over our government, it's kind of mind-boggling. But in addition to making demands on Biden, labor leaders are also seeking action from lawmakers on Capitol Hill by passing the Protecting the Right to Organize, or PRO Act. What would this act accomplish?
Yeah, the PRO Act is a really significant piece of legislation. It's hard to understate how important it is. It would be the most dramatic change to labor law in the United States since probably 1947, the Taft-Hartley Act. What the PRO Act would do is eliminate many of the legal barriers to forming a union that currently exist in the United States. It would eliminate the so-called right to work laws, which exist in 27 states. The right to work laws are essentially a way to defund unions in the private sector. So the PRO Act would eliminate right to work. It would also penalize employers who try to retaliate against workers for organizing, trying to form a union, prohibit employers from forcing their workers from attending anti-union meetings. It would also make the union certification process in the private sector more streamlined. It would make it go a little bit more quickly. It would also ban the permanent replacement of striking workers. So right now, when workers go on strike, they could conceivably be replaced permanently by their employer, but this bill would prohibit that. It would also allow secondary boycotts and secondary picketing, meaning like if workers at one company want to show support and solidarity for workers on strike at another company, they would be able to show their support, which currently under current labor laws is illegal. So there are, I guess, the long story short, there are just so many barriers to unionization and the right to strike that exist in the U.S., and the PRO Act would transform that, and thus allowing many more workers to unionize. I think many of the recent polls by Gallup and other organizations show that the vast majority of workers in the United States, like upwards of 60%, are pro-union. They favor unions, and yet it's only about 10% of workers in total and 6% in the private sector who have unions. And so that disparity between unions being very popular and yet so few workers having them has a lot to do with the current state of labor law, and the PRO Act, by reforming labor law to make it much more easy for workers to form a union and join a union if they want to, could just really, really transform labor relations, and then give more workers the opportunity to bargain with their employer for better wages and benefits and safer working conditions and paid time off and all of that.
Yeah, absolutely. And you make the point that in some parts of the country, get out the vote efforts of unions helped build Democratic victories. Is it your sense that lawmakers will perhaps want to return the favor?
Yeah, and I wouldn't put it as like returning the favor necessarily, but lawmakers simply recognizing, who got them to where they are, who got them into office. It was by and large, working class voters, and particularly people of color. If you look at states like Georgia and Nevada and Arizona and others, there were like unions like Unite Here, which is the hospitality workers union, or SEIU, the Service Employees International Union. They were, carrying out these massive and very impressive get out the vote efforts, reaching millions of workers, particularly people of color, working class people, getting them out to vote, voting for President Biden, flipping these traditionally red states, helping in the Georgia runoff elections so that the Democrats were able to take control of the Senate, all of that. So I think if the Democrats who have been elected, just recognizing why they won and what how these victories were accomplished, and looking at the fact that it really was, to a large extent, the get out the vote efforts of unions, and understanding that if they want to get reelected and stay in office, that they should probably start delivering, for some of these unions.
Listen to the people that got you there. I mean, this isn't new in politics, but sometimes it seems to be forgotten. We're speaking with Jeff Schuhrke, labor historian who teaches at the University of Illinois at Chicago. The labor organizers you spoke with were mindful of what they faced the last time the Democrats controlled both the House and the Senate. They failed to pass much needed labor law reform. How do you explain that failure?
Yeah, well, that was back in like 2009, 2010, the Employee Free Choice Act, or EFCA, which, similar to the PRO Act that we were just talking about, would have reformed labor law. I think part of the reason why it failed to pass was simply that it wasn't, on the one hand, it wasn't prioritized by Democrats in the Obama administration. And as far as the labor movement went, and unions, they kind of just assumed that because Democrats said on the campaign trail that they would support this legislation, that it would be passed. And so a lot of the unions, labor leaders, just thought if they should just be patient, and wait, and sooner or later, lawmakers would get to passing that legislation. And of course, it just didn't happen.
What is your sense of how labor will be organizing its effort to not see a repeat of 2009?
What a lot of the labor organizers, labor leaders told me when I was writing this article was that they're not going to take that wait and see approach this time. They're not going to just kind of sit back and be patient and expect that because candidates said that they would support the PRO Act, or other kinds of legislation, that they will automatically follow through on that. I think there's a much better sense now that they're going to have to keep the pressure on Democrats, on the Biden administration, even to some extent. They're open to trying to get some more moderate Republicans on board. They're not writing off anybody, really, is the sense I get. The International Union of Painters and Allied Trades, the IUPAT, is spearheading an effort, a campaign called Pass the PRO Act. It's a coalition that now involves hundreds of unions at the national, state, and local level, and central labor councils and state labor federations, to really move quickly and be much more proactive in trying to push this legislation and hold lawmakers accountable. They're also trying to build, and they are building, coalitions with other groups in racial justice, the racial justice movement, or the climate movement, other social justice and progressive movements outside of organized labor, building coalitions with them around the PRO Act and a wider agenda that it favors the working class as a whole. So overall, it's just a much more proactive approach than in 2009.
And you mentioned that hope for possibly attracting a few moderate Republicans, but there's another challenge right there, and that's facing labor leaders. It's to win back some of their rank and file who supported Trump, especially since 40% of union households voted for Trump. How can they do that without echoing much of Trump's divisive rhetoric?
Yeah, and that's kind of a really important question. And the sense I got from talking to some of the labor leaders and union organizers is that they certainly recognize this and see this as a problem for the labor movement. And the way they understand it is that they can't simply write off these union members or union households that were voting for Trump. They have to try to engage with them, and particularly, I think, understanding some of the reasons why they may have voted for Trump, and part of it having to do with the fact that for several decades now, working class people just haven't seen much much beneficial progress being made by the federal government, and promises from politicians being broken repeatedly over the years, and that kind of thing drawing a number of voters to somebody like Trump, who ran on being someone who's going to just kind of blow up everything and change, turn everything upside down. So I think there's a sense that they want to labor leaders and organizers understand that they really want to put the pressure on lawmakers to really deliver material gains, more economic security, higher wages, obviously economic relief right now with the pandemic, all kinds of other good things that working class voters can really feel, some real tangible change, and that having that be what pulls people away from Trump and false promises and false demagogues, and instead voting for candidates who are serious, and the Democratic Party in particular, which is really serious about trying to lift up working people.
It certainly feels different from 2009, obviously for many different reasons, but just the fact that you have somebody who was vice president then, now president now, and probably learned a lot about what they didn't do right, that they could have done differently, and that has to give you some level of hope, I would think.
Yeah, I am hopeful. I think many labor leaders, union activists are hopeful as well. Like I said, these first couple of weeks, President Biden has taken some really positive steps. And in addition, in Congress, both the Democrats in both the House and Senate have reintroduced the PRO Act already. It was originally passed by the House a year ago, but it didn't go anywhere in the Senate when Mitch McConnell was in charge of the Senate. So there's already been a lot of movement. But again, I think unions, the labor movement is not going to just go by wishful thinking. They're really moving forward to push Biden and congressional Democrats to take action.
Yeah, absolutely. And as well they should. Before we let you go, we can't end without talking about Marty Walsh as labor secretary. How does that go over with the labor leaders and organizers that you've spoken with?
Yeah, overall, he's a really popular choice with labor leaders. He has been for years a member of the Laborers Union Local 223 in Boston. He was an official for the union before he went into politics, before he became the mayor of Boston. I know President Richard Trumka, president of the AFL-CIO, preferred Marty Walsh, so he's a really popular choice. So that's another example of Biden really listening to union members and the labor movement. Yeah.
So we have a ways to go, but we're headed in the right direction.
Yeah, it seems that way, hopefully.
Okay. Fingers crossed, of course. Jeff Schuhrke, labor historian who teaches at the University of Illinois at Chicago, joining us today on the America's Democrats podcast. Jeff, we appreciate your time with us and would love to have you back again soon.
Thanks again. I'd love to be back. Thanks for having me.
Thank you. And this is the America's Democrats podcast, the weekly podcast for stand-up Democrats. We want you to sit back and listen, but we need you to stand up and fight. Help get our party back to its roots and to success at the ballot box. Make your contribution to keep the americasdemocrats.org podcast, a project of 21st Century Democrats, on the air, and help elect stand-up Democrats. Go to americasdemocrats.org and click on Donate at the top of the page. This is the America's Democrats podcast, the weekly podcast for stand-up Democrats. And now, Bill Press with Charlie Sykes, one of the original Never Trumpers, on the GOP's continued and dangerous embrace of Donald Trump.
I want to ask you a question that is the headline on Politico this morning. I'm sure you've seen it. Quote, anti-Trumpers are done with the GOP. Where do they go now? You've been writing a lot about this, Charlie.
Well, I feel seen with that headline.
Yeah.
Well, there's an interesting debate about whether or not there is a Republican Civil War, or whether that Republican Civil War is already over. And I tend to lean right now that it's over. Look, this is Trump's party. It is thoroughly Trump's party. The only primary challenges you're seeing are between the Trumpy candidate and the Trumpier candidate. So this does raise the question, where do anti-Trumpers go? I've been in exile for 5 years now. I've been a political orphan, so I'm no closer to an answer than I was when Donald Trump came down the golden escalator.
Did you vote for Donald Trump?
Never.
No. Did you vote for Joe Biden?
I did. No, for me, never Trump meant never. There was nothing ambiguous about it.
Right. So is there a Republican Party today that is not non-Donald? Is there a wing of the Republican Party that still exists, which is not Donald Trump, or just gone forever?
No, there is one, but it's a rump, and they're sort of huddled in the corner, hoping against hope that the crocodile that they raised in their bathtub won't eat them, or flipping metaphors, that the fever will pass. And I don't think they've fully realized how things have changed. I was actually, before we started the podcast, I was making notes on a piece about how crazy the state and local level Republican parties have gotten. If you think it's bad in Washington, D.C., it's gotten much worse among the grassroots. So it is really hard to imagine, a figure like a Mitt Romney or a Ben Sasse playing a significant role or wielding much influence in the National Republican Party in the short term.
Right. I was going to ask you who would be the leader of this rump? You mentioned two: Mitt Romney, Ben Sasse, Nikki Haley. I mean,
Nikki Haley's a windsock. I mean, I think she reflects more of what's wrong with the Republican Party, that she'll tiptoe out, put her toe in the water and criticize Trump, and then the moment there's any blowback, she comes scurrying back.
Trying to get a meeting at Mar-a-Lago.
Yeah.
All right. What do you see then the role of Mitch McConnell?
Well, there was a moment. There was kind of a little Arab Spring right after January 6th. It felt like, hey, something's happening here. Liz Cheney, of all people. Liz Cheney is not a rhino. She is hardcore conservative Republican. She stood up and denounced Trump in uncompromising language. I mean, there were no weasel words in that statement. And then Mitch McConnell let it be known that he was thoroughly disgusted. Then, of course, Mitch McConnell did what Mitch McConnell always does. Is he wants to have it both ways. He had a chance to hold him accountable, refused to do it, but denounced him. I think that he was testing the water. He's testing the water to see, is there, to your question, is there a rump Republican Party? Can he rally the donor class around him, the rational mainstream Republicans? And the evidence so far is no. And if Mitch McConnell can't do it, who can?
And certainly his goal is winning the Senate back in immediate goal, right, is winning the Senate back in 2022. Is it possible, do you believe, for a Republican candidate today to accept Joe Biden's election, to accept the fact that the election was not stolen and win a Republican primary?
That's a great question. I was thinking about that yesterday, watching Steve Scalise on Sunday. Steve Scalise, the House Whip, is on ABC, and he did two things. He tried to put the insurrection of January 6th down a memory hole, refused to attribute any blame for instigating that on Donald Trump, and number two, refused to really acknowledge the legitimacy of the election. And I think that's kind of a canary in a coal mine, that this is now the new litmus test, that you cannot be outraged about the January 6th insurrection or recognize Donald Trump's role in that, and you can't admit that the election was legitimate. You can't push back and say, no, it was not stolen. Donald Trump lied. Joe Biden won that election by 7 million votes. No, you can't say that anymore, which tells you about the baggage that Republicans take into 2022 and 2024, that they have to be now married to this lie for the next 2 or 4 years.
And that's the argument that some Republicans are trying to make, Mitt Romney and Ben Sasse and Mitch McConnell as well. But it doesn't seem to be certainly carrying the day. So Donald Trump is going to speak to CPAC this weekend, right? He's been invited. He'll be the keynote speaker. This is his first post-election kind of appearance. What do you expect to hear from him? Is he going to announce he's going to run?
No, but he's going to he is going to obviously strut upon the stage for a while and try to get people to believe that he still is the heir apparent, or I'm sorry, the presumptive nominee of 2024, and he may be. But I think that the CPAC, the Trumpian CPAC, is a pretty good indication of where the conservative movement is going. And we started off talking about Rush Limbaugh. And I think this all actually plays together, that while the right was wildly successful in creating an alternative media ecosystem and an alternative infrastructure, that what happened at a certain point is they stopped being in the business of persuading, of arguing. And what they do now is they talk to themselves. And as a result, they can win elections, but increasingly they're becoming very, very insular. And so it has become this echo chamber. And you'll see that at CPAC. CPAC used to have a wide range of conservative thinkers of a variety of different shades and hues. And now it's all Trump all the time, just like conservative media is all Trumpy. It's like your choice between Fox News, the crazy on Fox News, or the even crazier on Newsmax, or the even crazier on One America Network Now, or whatever it's called. So this is a real problem as they become increasingly doubling down on Trumpism and increasingly doubling down on this kind of, conspiracy theory, Marjorie Taylor Greene, big lie, my pillow guy type politics. They're going to continue to alienate a lot of voters in this country.
And continue, do you believe, to marginalize themselves, where, in fact, with the overall American political scene, that they're becoming less effective and less likely to win?
I do think so. And I think all you have to do is look at Georgia, Arizona, Virginia. Look at those states. Those states, you remember, Bill, those states used to be, quite Republican.
Absolutely.
I mean, if somebody would have told, your 20 years ago self, those states are going to have two, all of those states will have two Democratic senators, you would have thought, what color is the moon in your world? But this is what's been happening in one state after another. And so you're seeing that playing out in places like Ohio and Texas, Nevada, other places where, yes, this Trumpy approach wins primaries, but it does marginalize them in the general election. Now, having said that, here's the scary scenario. We are a two-party country. We're going to stay a two-party country. And it is not impossible that the Republican Party will come back into power. And the Republican Party that comes back into power is going to be very different than what we've seen in the past. And given its anti-democratic, authoritarian leanings, that's a scary prospect. So, yes, I think they're marginalizing themselves. But if we've been around politics for a long time, we know that Republicans have become experts at winning elections without winning votes, that they are comfortable with a strategy, a base-only strategy that allows them to have power while being a minority party. And I think that is alarming.
So you don't see any possibility of a third party?
Well, I have a lot of wishful thinking. And I can engage. I can engage in wish casting, and I'm talking with people. I mean, I'm in these chat groups where people talk about what the numbers look like for a center right centrist party.
Let me just jump in.
Yeah,
there was a conference call with about 120 leading Republicans from Republican administrations: Ronald Reagan, George H.W., George W. Bush, even Donald Trump. Some administration people, right? You may have been part of that call that talked about this party is not going to ever recover. We need to start a new conservative party based on our democratic institutions and respect for them. Do you see that going anywhere?
Well, I was on that call.
Okay.
And I listened. Yeah. And by the way, I agree with the premise. I mean, you asked me about that headline in Politico. I really think, and this has been something that has really been gelling since January 6th. I think there's been a good deal of disillusionment with the Republican Party. I think there are a lot of people who had hoped that when Donald Trump left, there'd be kind of a truth and reconciliation moment, or maybe there'd be a Khrushchev-like speech where we'd announce where we'd been, and then and we'd move on. But clearly, that's not going to happen. And what we saw from the Republican Party, we saw the number of Republicans that signed on to the big lie to overturn the election, voted to keep Marjorie Taylor Greene in office on her committee assignments, all of that, I think has driven a lot of people to say, okay, we're done. We're not going to rebuild this party. We have to find something new. But I don't underestimate the difficulty of doing that or the complication. So this was under the rules where we can't say who said what, but I'll tell you what I said. Whatever comes of it must be flexible.
Bill Press with Charlie Sykes. If you'd like to hear the entire episode, visit BillPressPods.com. And that's all for the America's Democrats podcast. Thank you to all who made today's show possible. Richard Eskow, Jeff Schuhrke, and the entire Bill Press team. And thank you for listening. If you liked what you heard, please get involved in our efforts to keep this show going and to elect Democrats who are bringing the party back to its roots. Go to americasdemocrats.org and click on Donate at the top of the page. And be sure to find 21st Century Democrats on Facebook and Twitter, and leave us a review on your favorite podcast app. For the America's Democrats podcast, I'm your host, Jim Cuddy. We want you to sit back and listen, but we need you to stand up and fight. Join us. Support the americasdemocrats.org podcast, a project of 21st Century Democrats, and help elect Democrats who will stand up for democratic principles with your contribution today. Go to americasdemocrats.org and click on Donate at the top of the page.